So let's continue on our lecture on endangered species and basic concepts on rarity and how species are predisposed to being endangered. So we did mention that smaller populations are greatly susceptible, more susceptible for extinction, and thus can become rare. Um, Small populations can increasingly become rare and thus predispose themselves towards extinction. Um, let's theoretically understand what that actually means or how it happens. So first I want to introduce you the concept of minimum viable population. So what that means, by definition, minimum viable population is the smallest isolated population having a 99% chance of remaining extant for 1,000 years despite foreseeable effects of demographic, environmental, and genetic stochasticity. Now, let's try to digest that particular theoretical definition. Smallest isolated population. Well, smallest like minimum number of comprising minimum possible number of individuals isolated, meaning there's no gene flow or individuals migrating back and forth. Having a 99% chance of remaining extinct, meaning 99% probability of not being extinct, right, for the next 1,000 years, despite foreseeable effects of demographic, environmental, and genetic stochasticity. What does that mean? Despite what? These phenomena. The demographic, environmental, and genetic stochasticity, a natural phenomena that a population undergoes, right? And we did explain briefly what these terms mean. Genetic stochasticity is actually random fluctuations in the allele frequency. Demographic stochasticity refers to random fluctuations in survival of individuals or random changes in individual level survivors within a particular generation cycle, right? And then environmental stochasticity refers to environmental natural background environmental variation primarily triggered by climate. Now, smallest unmanaged population with the highest chance of persistence is another simpler way of understanding this, right? So how do you determine the smallest unmanaged or naturally existing populations um, with the greatest chance of persistence? How do you calculate that? So for that, you actually have to employ mathematical modeling techniques called population viability analysis. Now, I am not going to explain you a population viability analysis. Explaining that itself requires another class. But basically, that process, helps you to calculate um, the smallest number of individuals um, that is required to sustain a particular population infinitely. Earlier, when we say for 1,000 years, we kind of alluding to infinite survival, right? But mathematically speaking, you need to put a real number. You cannot put infinity. That's why we put 1,000 there. Now, um, so because of so what this population viability analysis have shown us, if you look at the right side to the two graphs, those are two different um, population viability analyses. Um, if you look at the lower lower graph, you are looking at time on x-axis, population persistence on y-axis. What is the most evident picture here? Certain smaller population sizes, and then you're looking at the rams, right? Bighorn sheep in Rocky Mountains, right? Populations sizes that are lower than 50 goes extinct within 50 years, right? Like it doesn't really matter whether it's 50 or lower, right? Those populations have a very high probability of going extinct within first 50 years, within just 50 years, right? And again, in order to reach near perpetual persistence of the population, you need to at least have more than 100 individuals of bighorn sheep, right? Now, if you look at the top picture, what are we looking at over there? Well, again, on x-axis, you have time or the persistence of in terms of years, and y-axis you are looking at minimum viable population size. So what can we collect looking into that conceptual diagram? Different probabilities of survival, 50% and over 90%, right? So with 50% chance of population survival, right, in order for a particular population to sustain 10 years of longevity, you at least require 100 individuals, right? See what happens when you increase the chance of survival to 90% or greater, right? Um, so if the target is 90% chance of population surviving 100 years, right? It requires how many individuals? Look, 100 years persistence, it requires about 300 individuals. Now, it's kind of hard to read this graph because it's plotted on a georhythmic scale, right? That's why I kind of have this text over here. So to ensure 90% survival for 100 years, you require at least 3,000 individuals. See how exponentially the population, minimum population size increases, right? See how exponentially the minimum viable population size increases as you increase the period of survival and as you increase the probability of population persistence, right? And how about our theoretical target, 1,000 years? In order for a population to survive 1,000 years with a 90% probability of survival or greater, you require at least 100,000 individuals in that population minimum. So that kind of theoretical modeling clearly shows. I mean, imagine that the fact that theoretical modelings are oversimplified. There are lots of assumptions. There are lots of underlying parameters we try to control for in theoretical modeling, right? So the reality is actually worse than that. In reality, the demographic stochasticity, genetic stochasticity, and environmental stochasticity can be worse than included in these models, right? So smaller populations, regardless of the species identity, regardless of the location, have a greater chance of reaching extinction, right? And there is a very clear threshold that should be crossed to ensure near perpetual persistence of a particular population, right? And in a bighorn sheep, it seems like 100, right? All right, going back to our PowerPoint bullet points. So protecting, because of this principle, protection of small or shrinking populations, right, is extremely important, and that requires for us to consider all possible natural catastrophe, which actually accounts for environmental stochasticity, right? Even natural catastrophes that occur very infrequently should be considered, factored in when you are protecting small or declining populations, right? I mean, this could include hurricanes that occur periodically, seasonal hurricanes. Could be something as small as a windstorm, wildfire as a major impact, epidemic outbreak, drought years, right? So some of those environmental stochasticities are predictable, like epidemics are not predictable, right? You know, and some epidemics are actually, you can actually expect it to reoccur, so you can actually, tailor certain habitat management activities to mitigate impacts of that, right? If there's an oncoming drought, if it is predictable, of course you can actually, manage artificial water bodies, artificial water resources for that, right? And wildfire, if it is recurrent, it's actually a part of that. So you need to let the coast take. But could be certain populations that you may need to salvage or support to recuperate, after any of those events. So the point is, what if these stochastic events are predictable? Great, but what if they are unpredictable? Right. Well, then of course, it's quite hard to. That makes managing small populations even harder. Um, and you cannot just look at average conditions, right? Even for repeated disturbance events, right, you cannot look at the historical average of the wildfire impact, historical average of the hurricane, historical average of the water deficit in droughts. No, you have to look into even extreme events, right? What what is the most extreme possible scenario, right? How long will a particular drought will persist at its worst case scenario, right? So the modeling process should actually account for all the form of uncertainties, right? In order to those conceptual models, those theoretical models on population viability analysis to be useful for management decisions, you need to incorporate all the forms of uncertainties. It's not easy, it's mathematically hard. Sometimes calculations could be impossibly complex, but still, if you want to actually manage small populations, the modeling process should account for all of those intricacies. Hmm. Now, larger minimum viable populations, as you can see from these modeling processes, um, will have a greater chance of persistence, right? And for bighorn sheep, population sizes lower than 50 does not persist beyond 50 years, right? No matter how close the population is to 50, doesn't matter, right? If the population is greater than 50, it will at least persist for 50 years, right? And it will persist beyond 50 years. Sorry, if the population size is more than 50, then of course bighorn sheep will last for over 50 years, right? For minimum viable population for bighorn sheep to for them to persist infinitely, you, like I mentioned earlier, you need at least 100 individuals, right? And then in fact, um, in order to these models to be more realistic, you need to also consider the spatial constraints, right? So these guys don't have infinite resources, right? This is not a single population. It's a part of a community. So you need to actually consider those models with an spatially explicit mechanism. Right? You need to consider all the geographic spatial restrictions that is imposed upon this particular species, right? That you're trying to manage, and then the minimum dynamic area, right? Like what is the actual minimum habitat area that are available to them? And then also the other question is, in order to support the minimum viable population, what kind of a habitat area is required, right? So all of those actually, are very important management driven questions that we need to consider, we need to tackle through computer modeling, in order to protect, conserve small and declining populations. Okay, small populations are subjected to rapid decline, right, and are susceptible to local extirpations. Local extirpation is a situation where in a given metapopulation, or if a particular species exists in a few number of populations, extinction of a single or few local populations is what is meant by a local extirpation. Why? Well, one, small populations have very low genetic diversity, very low genetic variability. Right? So there are many problems that are related to lower genetic diversity. For example, inbreeding depression. Like I think we discussed this particular topic before, and you should be familiar with that by now through ecology. Inbreeding depression, right? It is the instant where, because of the reduced genetic diversity between two different individuals, if they interbreed, like it's similar to breeding between siblings, right? So the if the two breeding individuals have similar genetic or allele structure, right? They might run into problems with expression of lethal alleles, right, and genetic drift, right? So in other words, smaller populations are greatly susceptible to vagaries of random fluctuations in gene frequencies, right? And then demographic stochasticity, that is demographic fluctuations due to random variations in birth and death rates within a particular population. That is actually attributed to individual level variations in survival and reproduction. Very random fluctuations, variations among different individuals in a given population can introduce demographic stochasticities. Environmental fluctuations, due to variations in both density dependent and density independent population regulators, can drive major population fluctuations. Natural catastrophes, fire, storms, floods, yada yada yada. So the point is, if the population is large enough, the impact of demographic stochasticity is very low, right? It can absorb. It's like larger populations can buffer demographic stochasticity, can recuperate from environmental fluctuations, can recover or compensate for losses coming from natural catastrophes. So, because of all of that, small populations can suffer the worst, even from very basic population scale phenomena. So, now just to kindle your memory about genetic the vagaries of losing genetic diversity, I'm going to highlight a few key themes here with respect to conservation of small populations. Greater genetic diversity, um, those populations are armed with greater degree of evolutionary adaptations to fit into variable environmental conditions, and um, which actually increases that particular population's survival and successful reproduction. And if the genetic diversity is sufficiently large, even random rare mutations, right, plus um, migration or gene flow is good enough to generate and introduce new values into the population, to generate new traits that are likely adaptive. So small population sizes could lead to lower gene pools, right? Reduced genetic variation, right? Hence, ending up with lower genetic diversity. And this kind of situation is considered genetic bottlenecking, right? You have a large original population, but with declining numbers, declining population sizes, you end up with a small population. So when you're losing individuals from the population, you're also losing genes, particularly rare genes, rare alleles, beneficial alleles, right? And so ultimately, this kind of reduction, gradual reduction in genetic diversity from a larger population, from a large genetic gene pool, uh, kind of tapering down to a smaller genetic gene pool is considered genetic bottlenecking. So genetic drift is a term that kept coming up. By definition, it is frequent random temporal fluctuations in genetic diversity, right? So because of genetic diversity, in each generation, some individuals, just by random chance, just dumb luck, they will leave behind a few more offsprings than other individuals, meaning they will actually leave behind, you know, um, more genes than the others. So the genes of the next generation will be the genes of the lucky individuals, right? Not necessarily healthier individuals, not necessarily better individuals, not necessarily individuals that are a better fit for the environment, right? So genetic drift could operate in a non-directional, non-deterministic pathway, right? Genetic drift will not increase the fitness of a particular um, population. It's an evolutionary force, but it does not drive a particular population towards greater levels of adaptive fitnesses. So, in a nutshell, genetic drift can happen in any population. Okay, it could occur in any population. It could undergo genetic drift could undergo any population, regardless of the size. But the impact of genetic drift is much more pronounced in a smaller population, right? So, because of genetic drift, like I just mentioned, rare alleles, rare genes, beneficial alleles can disappear. Certain alleles that are actually non-beneficial, that are harmful, deleterious, lethal, can actually become fixed. So over the time, if genetic drift persists in a small population, you could end up in extremely high levels of genetic homogenization, right? Um, which actually, in other words, reflects reduced genetic heterozygosity. Before that, I do need to explain what's going on in this particular graph. On x-axis, you are looking at number of generations, number of reproductive cycles, in other words. In y-axis, you are looking at amount of genetic variability remaining after a repeated exposure to generations. So look at, and each curve you see in blues are actually small population sizes, and the red curves are smaller population sizes, and the blue curves are larger population sizes. Look at what is the red curves. With multiple generation times, the genetic variation keeps declining, right? So if population, the smaller the population size, the decline in the genetic diversity increases with increasing generations. So you might expect, wait, more generations meaning more reproductive cycles. Shouldn't it actually lead to increased genetic diversity through interbreeding? No, that's not what's happening actually. So things get worse over time if genetic drift persists in a small population. Now look at the blue curves. At larger population sizes, right, with increasing number of reproductive cycles, the genetic variability barely declines, right? It barely drops below the 90%. So again hammers my point, right? Larger populations will have greater genetic variability, high genetic diversity, and will suffer less from genetic drift. All right. So where do we observe evidence for loss of genetic diversity, and what has happened, like pragmatically, to wild populations that suffer reduced diversity? So can small populations recover their lost genetic diversity with time? Has there any evidence this happening? Well, mutations, let's see, how can you generate genetic diversity? There is actually one key evolutionary force that can do it: mutations. And we know that the frequency of mutations are rare, and mutations can take three different forms. They could be neutral, deleterious, beneficial, right? So actual probability of evolving a beneficial mutation through random mutations is extremely rare, like extremely low in probability and frequency, right? About 1 in 10,000, right? Or 1 in a, it could range, if you mathematically model, you can, because you can actually do modeling and calculate genetic frequencies, mutation frequencies for different populations. The better you know about their genome, more accurate you are in terms of calculating the mutation frequencies, right? We do have several wild species genome being properly mapped, so these are actually realistic. And since you can map out all the probable sequences of your nitrogenous bases. So, and by reshuffling them, you can actually calculate the probability of new mutations evolving in a given population. And this usually ranges between, at the best case, 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million, right? 1 in a 1 million to 1 in a 10,000. So that's actually how rare mutations are, right, in a natural population, natural unmanaged population. Even management itself, habitat management or population management, can only slightly tick this upwards by increasing the survival of the individuals that are produced. So, and then what else can help here? Well, migration can also introduce, new values from a different population into this declining population. So connectivity between different habitats does help. Connectivity between small to large populations does help. Blowy pine is actually a rare pine species, conservation dependent pine species, that is endemic to New South Wales of Australia. And currently they are only known from 40 reproductively mature corn producing adults and about 200 juvenile trees, that are younger trees that are not producing corns, or not producing corns in sufficient numbers to actually reproduce. And this pine is very environmentally resilient. It can grow as low as 5 degrees Celsius and can tolerate high temperatures as much as 40 degrees Celsius and can persist in much severe climatic conditions in environments as cold as 12 degrees Celsius, right? But with just 40 breeding pairs, um, there are evidence of extremely low genetic diversity, right? Um, so DNA sequencing in the surviving reproducing adult plants have revealed that all individuals are nearly genetically identical, right? And then another example is actually coming from okay, before that, this is actually the Willoughby pine, and that is the New South Wales uh, province in Australia, right? And then this is actually the specific national park where you have this surviving population. Um, and then this has been occurred in many other wild birds. Willow grouse, for example, um, is among the few birds that actually have massively suffered from loss of genetic diversity. In fact, there are about 89 bird species where genetic heterozygosity is extremely lower in conjunction with smaller and declining population sizes. So there are at least 89 species of birds that are of immediate conservation concern, and two of them are we are looking at the willow grouse um, and the Malagasy fish eagle in this particular diagram, right? Um, this figure over here shows, a plot between population sizes and heterozygosity or different bird species. And what you can clearly see is, other than few, random scatters, in generally, with increasing population size, you have evidence for greater genetic heterozygosity. All right, let's move on. So, well, what would you expect as results of reduced genetic diversity? We did talk about inbreeding depression repeatedly several times. So, inbreeding is the mating between closely related, genetically similar individuals, right? So, there are um, certain evolutionary mechanisms that exist to prevent inbreeding depression, right? There are sensory cues for kin selection or kin recognition. So when two individuals that are, able to mate, if they actually pass this kin recognition test, they behaviorally avoid mating with each other. And generally, um, among some of the mate selection strategies observed among species, there are certain phenomena where the mate selection process indirectly involve filtering against kin selection, right? Where you eliminate related kins and try to mate with more or less related individuals, and that happens through recognizing certain phenotypic traits, right? Um, similarity of features, it's a dead giveaway to avoid mating between closely related individuals. And behavioral inhibition, right? I mean, if kin recognition is possible, that leads to behavioral manifestations that avoid mating between two closely related individuals. And breeding migration, meaning individuals that actually occupy or den together outside the breeding season will migrate to alternative habitats for breeding to avoid um, interbreeding between closely related individuals. So we know that a given offspring receives two identical copies, right? If if offspring receives two identical copies of a defective allele or a deleterious allele from two closely related individuals, and that happening is much higher if breeding happens between two related individuals, that could result lethal manifestations, sublethal effects. It could be reduced offspring survival, stillbirths, right? Increased juvenile mortality, sterility, right? There are sperm abnormalities observed among juveniles that were born that was hired by closely related mating pairs. Offspring becoming weak, right, and reduced reproductive success of the offspring, right, and that like increasingly manifesting over multiple generations could happen with reduced genetic diversity being a problem, and all of that further decreases the population size, right, and that further extenuates the potential for inbreeding, right. Um, So this diagram actually shows an example of what happens to hatchling failure with increasing population bottleneck size, right? So when the population bottleneck is greater, meaning the reduction of the population, right? When there's a greater reduction in population sizes, the hatchling failure is much higher, right? With very, very small populations, right? You actually have very high rates of hatchling failure, right? Right, as you observe around here, very low population sizes means very high hatchling failures. When the population sizes increase, right, you experience very low hatching failure. And you guys know what hatching failure is. Hatching failure is when eggs don't hatch, when fledglings do not emerge from the egg, is a hatchling failure, right? And in fact, there are two birds that we are looking into this in terms of examples. The golden cheek warbler, this guy, right? So their hatching failure is very low. The reason is because their population is extremely high, right? Um, in contrast, the Japanese ibis, this guy over here, right, is right up there. Their population sizes are extremely lower, so are extremely susceptible to hatchling failure because of that. There are many examples that we can think about. Scarlet Gilia is actually a beautiful flower, like that one over here. Their population size is actually less than 100 individuals, right? And those individuals are also showing telltales of inbreeding depression. For example, their seeds are extremely smaller, right? Of which the germination success is very low, right? And the seedlings show maladaptations, increasing maladaptive traits to environmental stress, which further, peril the status of the future generations. And then Illinois prairie chicken population decline, right, um, have resulted in lower fertility and lower hatching success, right? I mean, they greater prairie chicken actually used to have a much broader distribution in the United States, right? But with hunting and habitat loss, it led to habitat fragmentation, and then the population sizes continued to decline even further, and ultimately the smaller populations started inbreeding, which actually led to lower fertility and lower hatching success. Um, the range you are looking at in the map is actually the natural range of scarlet gilia. I mean, look at this situation, right? Their original distribution ranges are quite broad, right? Spread over latitudes, meaning you are looking at an extremely resilient, environmentally tolerant plant. So it's not environmental stress that is driving this problem, right? Actually, loss of genetic diversity, which will lead to lack of adaptations for that particular plant to survive within its own historical range. Um, well, there are lots of issues that I do want to emphasize that comes about with loss of genetic diversity. So, you know very well about inbreeding depression. Well, how about outbreeding depression? Well, what is outbreeding depression? Outbreeding depression is actually the opposite of inbreeding depression, right? So that happens when breeding happens between same species that are genetically distinct, right? Particularly if this could happen, outbreeding depression can happen between closely related species, so different species that are closely related. If they are sister taxa that has been recently split into different species, there's still a chance that they can merge, right? So subspecies can also mate, right? And subspecies are actually, evolving branches, evolving branch tips that could someday, accrue more changes and become a new species. But outbreeding depression can actually lower the phylogenetic diversity, reduce or kind of backtrack the evolutionary trajectory, right? Bring, kind of merge two distinct species again into one. So this kind of inbreeding, outbreeding depression can be actually kind of visualized in a graph like this, right? So on x-axis, you are looking at the relatedness between the two mating parents, right? High at this end, low relatedness at that particular end, right? The relative fitness of the overall reproductive success over here, right? So um, when the relationship, the genetic relatedness between the two mating parents are intermediate, you actually gain the greatest fitness, right? If the two individuals are very close to each other, you suffer inbreeding depression, right? Which actually happens quite often and a much bigger conservation problem. Outbreeding depression is rarely observed. There are a few instances that it happened, but it happens in very lower frequency. So in that case, mating occurs between different individuals from closely related species or with different populations of the same species or different subspecies of the same species. Mm, yeah, I did mention that already. So what happens in this case? How does that actually overall reduce fitness and adult, other than adulterating the genetic pool? Um, So those two species that have split, when they come together and merge, the resulting offspring are known to have physiological and biochemical mismatches in their pathways. Their behavioral responses may not match with the environment, with the climate, right? Their endocrinal pathways, they are, biochemical reactions, how certain enzymes act with respect to different environmental conditions, how certain proteins express under different environmental conditions. All of those can be kind of fucked up. Um, so yeah, I mentioned mismatch in phenotypes and environment. So uh, phenotype is actually expression of a particular trait by an individual, right? And that usually happens in response to variable environmental conditions. But it has been observed that among outbred offsprings, right, the phenotypic expression doesn't match the current climatic and environmental conditions. So this could involve actually really bad scenarios where certain outbred or certain hybrids reproducing or laying eggs during winter when they're supposed to do that in summer, right? It could be that bad. So one example that I can think of, there are only a few examples, right, is actually um, replacement of the Slovakian ibex. This is an ibex, right? With hybrids from Austria, Turkey, and Egypt. So what happens over here is the Slovakian ibex populations were declining in their native range. So in order to introduce them back, there is no other surviving populations of Slovakian ibex. They looked into the closest relatives. Well, they were the hybrid, they were the Austrian, Turkey, and Egyptian ones. So they brought those populations and introduced all of those over here. What happens is those different populations started interbreeding, right? And they actually created this three-way, four-way hybrids, right? And those hybrids started doing the craziest things. They started reproducing in weird, really odd times, and where their offspring could not survive, right? Where populations actually even declined further, right? Californian wildflowers, as you can see in this image, right, can undergo this problem. In that case, the problem is, there are different species. Of course, they are coming from the same habitat, so they are still closely related, and they occur in close proximity to each other. So, if they are wind pollinated or animal pollinated, it's extremely easy for cross pollination to happen between different species, right? Um, so there are some populations for outbreeding depression, and that could actually adulterate the gene population and kind of mess up the adaptive traits, right? They already have. So you know what minimum viable population is. Another related, much more pragmatic concept is effective population size. Does total population size reflect the persistence of a population? In other words, in minimum viable population, we are looking at the total number of individuals. Well, does that really reflect the persistence of a given population? Can we rely on it that much? Do all individuals of a given population breed in a given season? No, even if all individuals in a given population are reproductively mature, well, in reality it is not. Even if we assume that is the case, right? Not all reproductively active, mature, fertile individuals will reproduce in each season, right? Some individuals, particularly females, tend to forego reproduction for multiple seasons consecutively. That's one problem. Why it happens? Because nutritional status, food availability, could vary across different seasons. If some seasons happens to be severe, more harsh, more resource rare, um, malnutrition, smaller body size, poor health conditions can actually, effectively decline the actual number of reproductively viable or reproductively active individuals in a given population. And most individuals in a population are actually too young, or either too old, right, or sterile, right, or dormant to actually take part in sexual reproduction. Plants undergo dormancy frequently, right? Um, and there are other problems. There are several species of birds, mammals, right, that are socially structured. There's a social hierarchy. There's a pecking order, right? Not every fertile female gets to mate. Not every fertile male gets to mate, right? There are certain groups, particularly prominent among social birds, right? Polygyny systems or polyandry. In those situations, there is actually polygyny is polyandry is multiple males, right? Where single female mates with multiple males. Polygyny is the opposite. In that case, single female mates with multiple females. In all of those cases, in this socially structured, hierarchically structured species aggregations, right? Not every individual in that group gets to reproduce, even if they are physiologically able to, right? Because the dominant male will not let them mate. Okay, so unequal sex ratios, it's kind of an example provided in that particular diagram. um, this has been observed in monogamous geese. If you are monogamous, the sex ratio must be 1 to 1. But what if for some weird reason the sex ratio is biased towards either male or female, right? um, Harems in elephant seals, right? The, or dominant females in African wild dog packs, right? All of those populations actually have, unequal sex ratios, right? So how, it's not reasonable to consider all individuals in a population as reproductively active or contributing to reproduction, when you're assessing the future trends of that particular population, right? And we also know that incidences like global warming and increased atmospheric temperature um, can alter the natural sex ratio, right, of a given population. This has been observed already for turtles and for fish. The grayling fish, the example you are looking at, and it's a fish endemic to New Zealand, right? Um, about 65% of the males were found in a given population prior to 1990. But after 1990, right, in a modern day, the grading population is actually heavily male biased. It's about today 80 to 90% of the individual of the fishes are males. That population was nearly 50-50 and now heavily male biased, right? So female limited.